On February 12, 1949, a man in his 30s named Leonardo Paez paced around a radio station in a city called Quito, which is the capital city of Ecuador. It was a Saturday night, and Leonardo and all the people around him were working very hard to get ready for an urgent broadcast. So Leonardo was the director of Radio Quito, which was a highly respected news station owned by a popular newspaper called El Comercio. Most people in Ecuador basically got all their news either from this news station or that newspaper, or both. And running a radio station with such a great reputation was really a source of pride for Leonardo, who had grown up in Quito. So he took his job very seriously, which was why tonight was such a big deal for him. He was about to deliver a potentially life-changing broadcast to the entire city. And just thinking about the gravity of this moment was making him feel sick and sweaty. In the room with Leonardo was a team of producers and sound technicians, as well as one of the station's top news anchors. Most of the last-minute work they were all doing involved organizing stacks of paper that contained instructions about what to say and what to do during this pivotal broadcast. That's what the anchor was double-checking right now. He was the one who had written the broadcast script, and he would be the one actually reading it on the air. Leonardo looked anxiously over at the clock on the wall. It was already a few minutes after 9 p.m., and they didn't have a lot of time left. But even though Leonardo desperately wanted to get this broadcast started as soon as possible, he knew he had to give his anchor the space and time to make sure they were 100% ready before they actually went on the air, because they really only had one chance to do this right. So instead of telling the anchor to come on, hurry it up, Leonardo instead bit his lip and just paced around the station, trying to distract himself by listening to the program that was currently being broadcast over the radio station's airwaves. It was a live musical performance from a duo of singers named Benitez and Valencia. These two combined were really famous, sort of like the Taylor Swift of 1940s Ecuador. And so when people in Quito knew these particular singers were performing on the radio, basically everybody stopped what they were doing and tuned in to listen. So in Quito in the 1940s, nobody had TV, and so radios were like the ultimate form of not just how to get your news, but also of entertainment. It's really where everybody turned. But radios were also very expensive and were sort of a luxury item, so not everybody had one. The people who did have radios would often bring theirs outside to the street so that other people could also hear the programs and the music. And Leonardo knew that all of this meant that at this very moment, all across the city, most of Quito's 250,000 residents were gathered around a radio. And he needed to get his broadcast on the air while he still had everybody's attention. He turned and saw the anchor finally lean back in his chair, indicating he was ready, and so Leonardo knew it was time to go live. Leonardo turned and nodded to his technicians, who were all sitting at a table covered in broadcasting equipment, and one of them, after seeing Leonardo's cue, leaned forward to adjust several knobs and then hit a button on the control panel. And the instant he did this, the voices of the singing duo cut off, and a large red sign that said "On Air" lit up on the wall right above the table. Basically, they were going to cut off the performance to do this broadcast and catch everybody in Quito off guard. And then the anchor leaned into their microphone and, in a very urgent voice, said that they were interrupting this musical program because there was an alarming event happening that everybody in Quito had to hear about. Then he explained the reason for this broadcast. Ecuador was being invaded. About half a mile away from the radio station, 17-year-old Jose Antonio stood outside a restaurant with some of his friends. Jose and his friends and all the diners, plus a bunch of people out on the sidewalk, had been gathered around the restaurant owner's radio, listening to Benitez and Valencia sing, when suddenly the music had cut out and the anchor had come on to say that their country was under attack. And so as Jose and this group is sort of caught off guard and listening to this sudden announcement, the announcer got really emphatic and said, "Listen, the city of Latacunga has been destroyed." And at that, Jose's mouth fell open and he felt this jolt of fear in his chest. Latacunga was only about 60 miles south of Quito. So Jose, along with everybody else around him, instinctively leaned into the radio so they could hear more about what was happening and why. But when they all did that, the broadcast suddenly stopped just as abruptly as it had come on, and the music program came back on. But the street got really quiet as Jose and the crowd just kind of stood there, waiting for something to happen. I mean, really nobody knew how to react to this. A few people began looking up at the sky, thinking maybe warplanes might be flying overhead, and actually Jose began doing that too, wondering if, that's the next step. But there were no planes, and there were no signs of, anything that would indicate that war was happening nearby, or, whatever destroyed Latacunga was approaching Quito. All Jose could hear was the echo of other radios around the city, now back to playing this musical program. But as the seconds ticked by and the crowd gradually began talking again and kind of going back to normal, some people began making jokes and suggesting that this broadcast was literally a joke, that was meant to be a prank. Others just kind of brushed the whole thing off and just went about their evening as if it had never even happened. However, Jose did notice that some of the people at the tables outside the restaurant where he was were still just kind of staring at the radio and shifting around like they were restless or uncomfortable, like clearly that broadcast had struck a nerve. Jose also kept fidgeting around and trading worried looks with his friends and the other people around him because he wasn't so sure this was a joke. And the reason he wasn't sure was because a sudden invasion of their country had actually happened before. 7 years earlier, in 1941, when Jose was just a kid, the much larger country of Peru had invaded Ecuador after an argument over land along a shared border. Instead of settling the argument diplomatically, the Peruvian army stormed into the disputed territory in Ecuador and conquered it pretty easily. And the fighting had only lasted for maybe about a month before Ecuador accepted that they had lost and retreated, giving up the land. But even though the fighting back then had never actually reached Quito, it had been a terrifying experience for residents of Quito because it made them realize they were not able to defend themselves against a foreign invader. But just then, as Jose and the others are sitting outside the restaurant kind of grappling with what could be going on here, how real is this, is this a prank? Just then, the music that had come back on again on the radio cut out, and once again, the broadcaster's voice came on, and they said they had an update. The enemy had landed their aircraft right on the outskirts of Quito in a northern area called Cotocollao, which was only 8 miles from the center of Quito. And suddenly Jose and the others realized that if the enemy had destroyed Latacunga in the south and now landed in Cotocollao in the north, then the city of Quito was effectively surrounded. But before Jose could even process this thought, another man's voice came on the radio. And unlike the first voice, which was emphatic but basically calm, this guy was absolutely panicked. He said he was the chief of Quito's newspaper, and then he basically screamed, "The airbase has been taken over by the enemy and destroyed. They're exterminating everything and everyone." He continued to yell that the enemy was using poisonous gas and they were using fire and they were literally killing people and destroying homes and buildings. And then he issued a simple and terrifying warning. They're coming. Jose felt himself let out this yelp that he couldn't even control. He was so suddenly terrified. But he didn't even hear it because all around him, everybody else seemed to react basically the same way all at once. And the streets erupted in screaming and praying and just absolute chaos. Some people began pointing up to the sky, yelling that they could see the enemy. More and more people suddenly began flooding out onto the streets, crowding around the radios, trying to hear more information. They're all terrified and they don't know what's going on. Jose wanted to begin to tell these new people who were coming outside sort of what he and others had heard so far, but everybody out on the street was sort of talking over each other. It was just complete madness. And then literally on the radio, there's all these different voices coming over because clearly the news station is panicked and they can't even get a cohesive message out over this broadcast. However, despite this madness, the one word that kept coming through on the radio that everybody heard was "Go hide. Hide from the enemy. Hide." And Jose and some other people around him were thinking about doing just that when finally a new voice took over the broadcast. And this man was louder and more authoritative than the others, and it sort of immediately projected calm, not just clearly calm on the other end on the broadcast side, but it sort of quelled the crowd for a second. This person sounded like an authority figure, and this person introduced himself as the mayor of Quito. And he said that yes, there are cities around Quito that are currently under attack, but he said he had clear direction that he wanted everybody in Quito to follow. But despite this instruction really being the first kind of clear next steps for people to follow, it didn't make Jose feel any better about this, because the mayor told the people of Quito that the women and children, they had to flee, go hide, go away, go find somewhere safe. But the men had to stay and fight. Jose felt this rush of adrenaline because he's thinking, am I old enough to be considered, one of the men? Will I be expected to fight, or are they going to tell me to go flee with the women and kids? Like, he didn't really know. But he had this calming thought. He's like, you know what? We're at war, and I am going to fight. So he signaled to his friends, sort of saying, all right, let's go, let's get ready here. And the group came together and they left the restaurant. And at that exact same second, a car came flying past on the street, narrowly missing Jose and his friends. And Jose saw it screech around the corner and out of sight before he heard this loud bang and the crunch of metal against stone. Immediately, some men ran after this car because clearly it had gotten into an accident and they need to go if they need help. But other people started running in the opposite direction. And so for Jose and his friends, it's like, what do we do? Do we go help with the car crash, or do we go, head to the front lines or something? At the same time, women were running by, clutching children, and Jose saw a pregnant woman stumble on past, grimacing as she held her stomach. Screams were echoing from all around him, along with the rapid pounding of boots on cobblestones as people basically ran in every direction. Jose was still trying to figure out which way he should go and what he and his friends should actually do here when he heard a news speaker's voice come on the radio, who announced himself as the Minister of Government, which was basically like the person who controls the security of the entire country of Ecuador. And the Minister of Government said to forget about what the mayor had told them about fighting the enemy, because Ecuador's weapons were literally not powerful enough. There was nothing that anyone in Ecuador could do. This is what the minister said. He basically said, we're going to lose. Just then, another new voice came on the radio. It was this very fast-talking man who said he was actually reporting live on the ground in Quito. Then he screamed out over the broadcast for everyone to run. And then his feed abruptly cut out. And then the original announcer came back on, and his voice shook as he said that reporter who had just said for everybody to run had just been killed. It was 9:21 p.m. 21 minutes had elapsed since this broadcast first went over the air, announcing this invasion of Ecuador. And in that time, it was like the country had spiraled into absolute madness. Now, remember, at this point, Jose is gathered with his friends. He's sort of begun to leave the restaurant, but so many things have happened all around him that he and his friends are just kind of standing there near the restaurant, not really sure what to do. And as they're standing there, Jose noticed that all these people who previously had just remained seated or remained near radios, it was like everybody all at once just got up and began running in different directions, running to the churches, running to their homes. It was like the entire country truly was just in full-blown panic mode. Jose also began to notice families come running out of their homes, dragging suitcases and belongings with them, getting ready to, evacuate hopefully, but where could they even go? They're surrounded. And just then, Jose heard the sound of glass shattering, and he saw a few people over at the restaurant's bar taking liquor from the shelves and pouring themselves drinks before tossing the bottles on the floor. Jose looked and realized his friends had already left him, so he's just standing here all alone. And he knew by this point he can't just keep standing here thinking about what he's going to do. He needs to do something. He needs to act. But just then, the radio crackled back to life, and once again there was a voice calling out one final update. But it was so crazy all around him, Jose couldn't understand what this final update actually was. He just didn't hear it. However, Jose could clearly see other people around him had heard this final update, and they were obviously reacting to it because they stopped. Everybody stopped running around. They put down their suitcases, and everyone just kind of stood there. And then people began going for their guns and knives and torches. And then, once this huge, now armed crowd came together, they began to move as one, all in the direction of the city center. In the city center, in the Radio Quito station, Leonardo watched as the anchor delivered that final update, the one that Jose had not heard but others had and clearly reacted to. A minute later, Leonardo heard glass shattering somewhere one floor below him, along with a loud crackling sound. Then he smelled smoke, and he noticed the air in front of him inside the studio was getting hazy. And then from outside the building, he heard somebody yelling, "Fire!" Behind Leonardo, The anchor grabbed the microphone and pleaded on air to anybody who was listening that the radio station was in trouble and to please come help. But there really was no one left to help them. They were on their own. And when Leonardo and his team realized this, they knew they had to get out of this station by themselves. And so they ran together down the stairs to the exit. But before they even got to the bottom of the steps, the smoke from the fire became so thick they couldn't even breathe. Leonardo realized that the whole first floor must be engulfed in flames. And so the only way out was actually to go up, not down. So Leonardo led the group back up the way they came, running back through the second floor office building, the studio space, where they had recorded the broadcast, and headed up the stairs to the very top floor. And by the time Leonardo got to the top floor, he could hear screams coming from somewhere below him, and they sounded painful and horrible. He hoped his coworkers had been able to follow him up here, but by this point there was so much smoke in the building, he really couldn't see, so he didn't know who was here with him and who had been left behind. And also the roar of the fire was getting louder by the minute, and it was so hot that sweat poured from Leonardo's face and it stung his eyes. And so Leonardo instinctively ran away from the smoke towards the windows, and because they're on the top floor, 3 floors up, looking out, he had a good view of the ground below. And he saw these huge crowds of people on the street. Most of them were holding torches and seemed to be running around in random patterns, while big military tanks rolled in behind them, along with this hazy mist from some kind of gas kind of flowing across the entire crowd. Just then, Leonardo felt the floor under his feet begin to shake, and he frantically began to think, how am I going to get out of here? I need to escape. And that's when he saw the roof next door. So the radio station sat next door to a school, which was at this point not yet on fire. Now, the school building was not connected to the radio station, but it was close enough that Leonardo realized that he might be able to open up a window that he's standing right near, get a running start, and literally jump out the window and land on the school roof. Now, obviously, if he undershot this jump, he would fall to the street below and die, but the alternative was stay here and be burned alive. So Leonardo just opened up the window, he backed up, took a deep breath, got a running start, and jumped out the window. He flew into the air, arms flailing as he willed himself to land on the school roof, and after a millisecond in the air, he comes crashing down, slams onto the school building. He had made it. It was painful, but he had escaped. But Leonardo didn't have time to waste here, nor did he really have time to wait to see if others would also make this jump. He really felt like he's sort of on his own here. And so up he got, and despite the pain from impacting the roof, he was basically okay. And he walked across the school building until he went to the next roof. Basically, the next building butted up against the school building. So he climbs onto that roof, and he walks across that roof until he reaches the next building. Again, these buildings are all connected, so there's no more jumping from, one building to the next, but he is going roof to roof, basically high up above the streets of Quito. And down below, he sees, all this madness with the tanks and all these people with torches. He doesn't really know what's going on here. And eventually, he reaches a roof, as he makes his way, that a family was sitting on. And the family, they were looking out at the city, where the sky was still glowing from the light of the fire Leonardo had just escaped from. And when they saw Leonardo, they told him they had actually been down on the streets in that crowd. But when it became too dangerous, they had come up here to escape. And they asked Leonardo, had he done the same thing? Is that why he was here? Leonardo said no, and then he told them who he was and how he actually arrived here and why, and then he asked them for help. And for a second, the family just stared at him in shock. But then they began to talk to each other, and from what Leonardo could hear, and also based on facial expressions, the family seemed mad. But finally, the father looked at Leonardo and said yes, they would help him. However, there was a condition. He told Leonardo that under no circumstances could he, Leonardo, go down on the street with that crowd. The father said Leonardo would have to hide out in this family's house because, the father explained, that everybody in the city, including all those people down there, wanted Leonardo's head. It would turn out Leonardo's broadcast had actually been wildly successful. It had done exactly what he hoped it would do. It grabbed the attention of basically everybody in Quito. The whole city stopped in its tracks to listen to what the broadcast had to say. However, there was one very important fact that Leonardo had decided Not to mention in this broadcast until the very end, when in many ways it was already too late. This fact was the final update, the one Jose had not been able to hear, but that had caused everybody on the street who had heard it to stop running around, stop screaming, and just get their guns, knives, and torches and head towards the center of town. The fact that was held off until the very end was this whole broadcast was a farce. The invasion was not real. It was an act, a prank, a joke. The broadcast was like this play. It was an adaptation of a fiction novel called War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which is about an alien invasion. And so what Leonardo did is he orchestrated this broadcast to sound and feel like a real breaking news broadcast about an alien invasion. The exact same thing had actually been done in the United States a few years earlier in 1938. But in the American version, the listeners had been warned at the beginning of the broadcast that it was not real, and it still caused mass panic, even though they had been warned. And so, during Leonardo's broadcast, when he finally revealed the truth at the very end, the listeners were not, soothed. They were not like, oh boy, what a great prank. They were furious. So furious, in fact, that they went to the radio station in the city center where Leonardo and his broadcast crew were, and they lit it on fire. And so between the radio station fire and also between all the people who took their own lives preemptively, believing aliens were going to be here any minute to kill them, torture them, abduct them, the death toll from this night, from this farce, was between 6 and 20 people. And a whole lot more people were also injured in the chaos. As for 17-year-old Jose Antonio, he would survive, and later in life, he would actually give a tell-all interview about his experience during the so-called alien invasion. As for Leonardo, he didn't face any criminal charges, no jail time, nothing. But this whole incident really destroyed his credibility, and it made people not trust him in Ecuador. So it was basically impossible to get work. And so eventually he had to move to Venezuela. And then as for Radio Quito, the at one point very influential, very important news broadcast, they wouldn't make another broadcast for 2 whole years after this incident. On the evening of Sunday, January 26, 1851, a 23-year-old man named Bailey Staples hurried up the walkway of a home in Fall River, Massachusetts. It was so cold that Bailey's could see his breath. But despite the weather, he could not stop smiling. And that was because he was about to do something that he loved to do that made him a lot of money, and it was actually the 3rd time that day that he was even doing it. I mean, this was awesome. Bailey's was a psychic medium, and he was about to perform a seance. So at this point in America, in 1851, there was this phenomenon going on called the spiritualist movement. Basically, huge numbers of people began to believe that the living and the dead could actually communicate with each other through mediums like Bailey's. And at this time, there was a very specific way that mediums like Bailey's conducted their seances. They would sit at a round table along with all their guests that were going to participate, and they would summon spirits. And what would happen is the participants in these seances could literally tell when it was that the spirit actually made contact with the medium. Because the round table they were all sitting at would shake or move, sometimes the table would thump so violently that one of the legs of the table would break off. And a broken table at a seance was considered a huge success. So seances were a craze all over the country, and many people did genuinely believe that, people like Bailey's, mediums, could talk to ghosts in these seances. But there were lots of people also who didn't believe any of it, thought it was completely made up, but they would still hire people like Bailey's to have these seances at parties and other functions as sort of a form of entertainment, kind of like how you might hire a band or a magician. And in Fall River, Massachusetts, there really was a big appetite for these seances, both, because people believed they were true and lots of people who thought they were fake. And it's in part because there were lots of homes in Fall River, Massachusetts at the time that sort of had some history about being haunted, and so there was sort of groundwork laid for both believers and non-believers to contract people like Bailey's. Now, to be clear, Bailey's whole seance act was a blatant fake. In fact, many of the people who hired Bailey's knew in advance that it was all an act, that Bailey's really was more of a performer than a psychic medium. But Bailey's was really good at faking it, and so he had become kind of like the go-to medium, certainly in Fall River, which meant for him to maintain this flow of business, he really had to put full energy into every performance to keep getting people to call on him. So on this day, as Bailey's is sitting there getting ready to start his third seance of the day, he was tired. I mean, it's pretty exhausting to do these performances, but he knew he just had to get that second wind and just push through and do as good of a job as he possibly could. And so as the homeowner of this third seance opened up the door and let him inside, Bailey's was sure this was going to be at least as good, if not better, than the other performances of the day. Moments later, the homeowner, John Gardner, led Bailey's into the living room where several other guests were already gathered. Bailey's immediately snapped into character. He swooshed his cape as he walked in, and he waved his hand around the room to command their attention. And when everyone turned to look at him, he said, "I have broken 2 tables today, and now I've come to break yours." The guests all cheered and clapped, and Bailey's could tell they were going to be a very enthusiastic audience, which always made these seances much more fun. So into the parlor they all went, and they all took a seat around this big circular table in the middle of the room. And then Bailey's dimmed the lights and walked around the table giving his instructions. He then told them to all hover their hands over the table with their palms down and their fingers spread, and that each of them would have to touch the hands of the person sitting next to them. He told them that once they were all touching, it would create a circuit that was more inviting to the spirits. And so once all of his guests got into position with their hands, Bailey's took his seat and did the same thing with his own hands, creating a full circuit all the way around the table. And at that point, everybody was ready. And so he nodded, and in a commanding voice, he said that now he was going to speak to the spirits. And if the spirits in the room felt like answering, they would move this table. The room got deadly quiet as everyone waited to see what Bailey's would do. But Bailey's just let the tension grow, because he knew that the longer he waited, the more anticipation would build. This was actually Bailey's favorite part of the performance, and he could feel his own heart begin to race. I mean, this really was exciting. But then finally, he broke the silence and called out to the spirits in the room and demanded that if there were a ghost here, to make itself known. And at this, everyone immediately began to look around excitedly, which created the quick distraction that Bailey's actually needed to perform his first trick. So mediums used a few different tools to help them fake communication from these ghosts, and one of those tools were these special hooks that they actually attached to their wrists, and they hid them under their sleeves. And then when they put their hands palm down, hovering over the table like they told everybody else to do, those hooks would actually go below the table and grip on, so the medium could, without looking like they're actually touching the table, literally lift the table up and rattle it around, again, without appearing to actually touch it. Now, it actually took a lot of strength to do this. I mean, imagine moving a huge table around just like with your arms kind of hovering over the table. But Bailey's was getting really good at it. And so as his guests were all looking around, looking out for ghosts, Bailey's masterfully hooked his hooks right under the table and began moving his wrists around, which caused the table to thump. And as soon as this happened, a woman on the other side of the table screamed, and the other guests began laughing and getting really excited. But Bailey's was only just getting started. He called out to the spirit again, much more forcefully this time. And as he did, he literally made the table rise off the floor as all the guests gasped. One man asked how Bailey's was even doing this. I mean, he knew this was fake, but how are you lifting the table up? Because his hands are over the table, remember. It's just these secret hooks underneath. But Bailey's just kind of ignored the man and smiled. And then he said to the spirit that if you're willing to communicate with us, rap on this table one time. And then Bailey's used the hook, underneath the table to make a knocking sound. And as he did this, the woman who had first screamed on the other side of the table, she jumped. She was so scared. And it actually caused Bailey's to have this surge of adrenaline, like he was really doing a good job. And so Bailey's actually kind of leaned into this and rattled the table a bit more for dramatic effect. And in doing this, Bailey's was really exerting himself. He's trying not to give off the vibe that he's moving this table around, but he really is. And so he's sweating bullets, and he's also yelling out to the spirit, demanding them to come forward and talk to us. But then, as Bailey's is doing this big act here that he in no way suspects is going to actually call spirits into the room, he suddenly felt the room turn icy cold, and he had this weird tingling sensation flowing through him. He blinked, and then his vision got hazy. This had never happened to him during any of his seances. And clearly it was having an effect on him because he no longer was trying to communicate with the dead. He was just kind of standing there, very uneasy, like the seance was actually doing something, that there really might be spirits in the room. Now, Bailey's can tell he's getting stared at, and he doesn't want to destroy his business here. Like, he needs to maintain the act. He can't just spook himself out and stop the seance. But at the same time, he couldn't break out of this weird feeling he had. The room felt so cold. I mean, something was off here. And then he tried to move, and it was like he couldn't. He was frozen. Now, at the same time Bailey's is experiencing this, across the table, the homeowner and host, John Gardner, is just sitting there staring at Bailey's, trying to figure out what's actually happening here. And from his perspective, he watched as Bailey's went from sort of standing there awkwardly, unable to move, it looked like, to then sitting down in his chair and sort of lurching back in this awkward position. And then Bailey's eyes began darting all over the room, and also his breathing got really ragged and heavy. And John couldn't help but feel like it looks like Bailey's is possessed for real. And then Bailey's began to speak, and his voice sort of cracked as he did, and he began mumbling something that John and the others couldn't understand. I mean, John, he really couldn't help it. He felt sort of spooked by this. I mean, this was really convincing. John actually wanted to applaud. I mean, Bailey's acting was so good here. But he also didn't want to destroy the act and sort of break his character. You know, like Bailey's, John and most of his guests did not believe seances were real at all. But, I mean, Bailey's performance was really turning out to be way better than any of them had expected. But just then, Bailey's shot up out of his chair, and the whole table thumped again and shook, and then Bailey's let out this almost ghostly-sounding moan, and then one of John's guests asked if the ghost was speaking through Bailey's. But instead of answering, Bailey's eyes rolled all the way back in his head, so only the whites were visible. John and the others were transfixed. I mean, this was just incredible, like really kind of scary stuff here. But then Bailey's let out another moan, and then fell backwards hard onto the ground. And for a second, there was just confused silence. Because if this is an act, I mean, that was a violent fall. This looks really legitimate. How is Bailey's able to do this over and over again? This seems real. And it was in that moment of realizing that something is off here that some of the guests began to scream and they began to run out of the room. A few minutes later, a local physician named Dr. Hopper ran into the parlor of John Gardner's home. He'd been summoned by one of the guests who had panicked and actually ran out and gotten him. But that guest had been rambling about a ghost and a possession, so Dr. Hopper really wasn't sure what kind of problem he was actually responding to. But now he could see there was a group of people dressed for a party gathered around what appeared to be a seance table, pointing to the floor, where there was this young man lying in a crumpled heap. Dr. Harper went to the young man and reached out and felt the man's neck, but there was no pulse. And so the doctor turned and looked at the group and said, "He's dead." And before the group could really even react, the doctor said, "Now hold on, someone needs to slowly and clearly explain what happened here." John Gardner stepped forward and now in a very shaking voice explained that this young man was a medium whose name was Bailey Staples. And he had been doing a seance, and he had demanded a ghost talk to the group. And then a moment later, he was thrashing around, apparently possessed by this ghost, and then he fell to the ground, dead. John said they had all thought this seance was a fake. I mean, when they hired Bailey's, they literally thought this was just going to be a performance, nothing real. But now, I mean, they didn't know what to think. This looked very real. Dr. Hopper shook his head, not really sure what to make of this explanation. He certainly did not believe in ghosts. But after a quick examination of Bailey's, he really couldn't see any obvious cause for the medium's death. So Dr. Hopper got to his feet and told the dinner guests that, whatever killed Bailey Staples was not a ghost, but he didn't know what it was yet. However, he would get to the bottom of it. However, by the next morning, news of Bailey's death had spread all over Fall River and beyond, and it made the immediate autopsy that Dr. Hopper wanted to do to figure out what happened to him basically impossible. Now, the reason it was impossible is because some people were claiming that this was a ghost that possessed Baylis, but it didn't actually kill him. The ghost must have put Baylis into a trance where he appears dead, but is not actually dead. But if Dr. Hopper performs the autopsy on him, the autopsy will kill Baylis, so you can't do that. And so pretty quickly, you have all these people that are showing up at Dr. Hopper's clinic and the local police station demanding authorities give them Baylis' body to prevent the doctor from killing him by doing an autopsy on him. And so it's this whole scene. And at the same time, keep in mind, the country as a whole has been taken with seances. That was already something that was sort of happening everywhere. But this story, which sort of legitimized the idea that ghosts could be real and ghosts can also be dangerous given what happened to Baylis, this story is spreading like wildfire all over the country. And so at a time where people in America were already big on seances, this pretty much dumped gasoline on that, and seances became even more popular, but now because they felt real, not because they were entertainment. On January 28th, so 2 days after Baylis was pronounced dead, Dr. Hopper stood in the basement of the local morgue holding a scalpel. He had finally gotten the approval to go ahead and conduct his autopsy, but he knew that a lot of people were not happy about it. And now he was looking down at Baylis' body, realizing that, to his own surprise, he was sort of nervous about this. Like the idea that, what if this guy's actually still alive and I'm about to kill him with this autopsy? Now, logically, the doctor did not think Baylis was in a trance, but it was unsettling how physically healthy Baylis' body looked. He was young and strong with no history of illness, and there wasn't a mark on his body anywhere to explain why he was dead. The only blemishes on his skin were these slight bruises around his wrists, which Dr. Hopper understood were from the special hooks he had been wearing when he died to lift up the table. But Dr. Hopper shook off the nerves and moved his scalpel towards the skin of Baylis' chest and made his first incision, opening up the chest cavity. And that was when Dr. Hopper saw it. It would turn out, on the day Baylis Staples died, he was at his absolute performative peak as he lifted John Gardner's table up off the ground and made the seance guests scream and laugh. But what Baylis didn't know, and what Dr. Hopper found when he performed the autopsy, was that Baylis had a pre-existing heart condition, and his passionate performance, coupled with the physical exertion it took to lift up that heavy parlor table with just his wrists, and the fact that Baylis had also already given 2 other similar performances that day, caused his weak heart to swell and develop an aneurysm which ruptured and caused fatal internal bleeding. Baylis Staples had basically put on the absolute best seance performance of his life. It was so good, in fact, that it killed him, and also accidentally convinced an entire house full of dinner guests and many people all across the country that ghosts were real. Peggy Carr's life had never been very easy. She was born in 1947 in a very small rural town in Central Florida to parents who were deaf and who had almost no money. So from a young age, Peggy had to go to work, except the only jobs she could land were either extremely low paying or they were just outright dangerous, like overnight shifts at isolated truck stops on deserted highways where she would waitress there all by herself. But Peggy never complained about her job prospects. Instead, she just took whatever jobs were available because she knew that she and her family needed the money. And whenever she was working in a dangerous environment, she would intentionally put on this very tough exterior to make sure no one attempted to take advantage of her. And despite her small stature, she quickly developed a reputation amongst her coworkers as somebody you did not want to mess with. Peggy didn't take crap from anybody. But while this kind of prickly outer shell protected her from potential predators, it also warded off potential romantic partners that might have been interested in her, but were kind of intimidated when they interacted with her. But eventually, one man would cut through Peggy's defenses, and they would fall in love, and they would get married, and they would have 3 kids together, and everything was great, until it wasn't. The marriage would crash and burn, and so by the mid-1980s, Peggy was a mid-30-somethings divorced mother of 3 teenage children who had to work overtime at a local diner just to barely make ends meet. And while she still acted very tough and composed when she was working or when she was out in public, when she was behind closed doors at her home with her kids, they saw the real side of Peggy. And that side was just kind of sad. I mean, life had just been kind of hard on her, and she had tried so hard to provide a safe and happy home for her kids, and she felt like she had kind of let them down. But her kids, on the other hand, were not bitter towards their mother for the divorce. It just pained them to see her so upset. And so her kids really hoped that one day their mom would meet somebody new, she would fall in love all over again, and maybe that would put a smile back on her face. And in late 1987, that is exactly what happened. That year, Peggy met a man named Mrballen Carr. Mrballen, who just went by his nickname, Pie, was a lot like Peggy. He was a recently divorced single father of 2 teenage children. He didn't take crap from anyone, and like Peggy, he had been kind of forced to start working at a fairly young age. When Peggy met him, he was living with his 2 kids in another tiny central Floridian rural town called Alturas, and he was the foreman of a local phosphate mining company there. Phosphate is a chemical that has a number of industrial and consumer uses. So Peggy and Pie, they start dating, and right away, Peggy's kids notice this huge shift in their mother. I mean, now she's all smiles, she's so happy. It seems like Pie is the knight in shining armor that's come to save the day. And then, just a couple of months later, in April of 1988, Pie and Peggy would get married, much to their children's excitement. And then after the marriage was finalized, Peggy and her 3 kids moved in with Pie and his 2 kids in his home in Alturas, Florida. And for a while, this newly blended family worked out perfectly, even though they were living in a fairly small house. And so all 5 of them were kind of all over each other, but they got along great. And it was kind of fun to have so many people in this house all the time. It was kind of crazy and hectic, and overall, the house just felt like it was bursting with life. But within a few months of Peggy and her kids moving in with Pie and his kids, Peggy and Pie started to have marital issues. It was like all their early chemistry had just totally vanished, and in its place was nothing. They basically completely resented each other, and everything they did upset the other person. And then, adding fuel to the fire, were rumors that began spreading around this small town where everybody knows each other, that Pie was apparently back together with an ex-girlfriend, and so he was having an affair. And so Pie, he denied these accusations, but Debbie totally believed them. And so their fights got worse and worse and worse, and the more they fought, the more a wedge was kind of driven down the center of this blended family, where Peggy's kids automatically took their mother's side, and Pie's kids automatically took their dad's side. And so from the outside looking in, it seemed plainly obvious that Pie and Peggy's marriage was not going to last. But before their marriage could fall apart, something totally unexpected happened that would link these 2 families together forever. In late October of 1988, so 7 months into Peggy and Pie's now very rocky marriage, Pie suddenly got up one morning and just told Peggy he was leaving for the whole day to go hunting. This was not a planned trip, he just wanted to get away. And at this point, neither of them wanted to spend any time with each other, so Peggy didn't care. She said, "Go ahead, enjoy your trip, I'll see you later." And so Pie, he leaves the house, he gets in his truck, he drives off, and then a little while later, Peggy and her daughter, Sissy, they both get their things together, and they head out and they get in Peggy's car, and they drive into town. Both Peggy and her daughter worked at the same diner as waitresses, and they both had a shift that morning. And so they arrive at the diner, they both get out, they go inside, they get their things on, and they begin their shift like normal. But not long into the shift, Peggy was about to walk up to one of her tables when she noticed her heart was racing. And she had not been running around the restaurant, she had not done any heavy lifting. There was no reason for her heart to suddenly be beating at a really fast clip. And so initially, Peggy tried to just ignore it, thinking that her heart would slow down and she would go back to normal. But when her racing heart persisted, she walked away from the table she was waiting on and snuck off into the staff bathroom, and she sat in one of the stalls, she shut the door, and she just sat on the toilet waiting for her heart to stop racing. But as she sat there, not only did her heart only continue to thump like mad, but she started to notice her legs were tingling and so were her arms. Now, Peggy was a no-nonsense person. She was not prone to panicking or overreacting or anything like that. And so as she's sitting there feeling these symptoms, it dawns on her that maybe I'm having a heart attack. And so she decides, okay, I'm going to deal with this. She stands up, she opens the stall door, she goes to the sink, she washes her hands, she washes her face, she kind of calms herself down, and then she walks out of the bathroom, she goes right into the staff break room, and she tells her daughter, I think I'm having a heart attack, but don't worry, I'm just gonna go home, I'm gonna lay down. If this gets worse, I will go to the hospital. But for right now, I don't really know what it is, but I wanna take it seriously, so I'm gonna leave for the day. And so Sissy is looking at her mom, really concerned, but Sissy knows what her mom is like. Her mom is tough as nails. She is the type of person that's gonna sleep off a heart attack. And so she says to her mom, okay, go home. I'll be sure to check on you as soon as I get back, and please call me if anything changes. And so Peggy, whose heart was still racing and her arms and her legs were still tingling, she told her daughter, everything's going to be fine. And then she told her manager that she was leaving. And then Peggy slipped out the back door. She got in her car and she drove back home. When she got there, the house was empty. So she just went inside. She made her way to her bedroom and she lied down in her bed to try to get some rest. That afternoon, Peggy's son, Dwayne, came home from high school, and when he walked inside, he found his mother laying down in her bed. This was very unusual for Dwayne because his mother never took naps. In fact, he could not recall a time ever that he saw his mom napping, even when she was sick. And so concerned, he went into her bedroom and she was facing away from him. And so he kind of jostled her awake. And when his mom rolled over to face him, her face was pale. She was sweating. She obviously had not been sleeping. She was gritting her teeth and it looked like she was in a lot of pain or some sort of discomfort. And he said, Mom, geez, are you okay? And she would say to him, oh, no, I'm fine. I'm just sleeping something off. I got something going on. I think I have a flu or something. I don't know. I took off from work, so I'm just sleeping it off. And so Dwayne, he knows his mom is tough as nails. And if she says she's going to sleep something off, then she'll be just fine. And so Dwayne said, okay, well, let me know if you need anything. And so Dwayne began to walk away, but his mother would actually flag him back and she would level with him and she would tell him that actually something is wrong here. I feel like someone has poured fire down my veins in my arms and in my legs, and it is excruciatingly painful. And so Dwayne is hearing his mother say this, and he knows his mother is not the type of person to complain or exaggerate or anything. She is just straight no nonsense. And so for her to say this is the most excruciating pain she's ever been in, and she's laying in bed unable to move, he knew this was really serious. And so Dwayne began telling his mom that you got to go to the hospital. We need to get Pi here to drive you to the hospital, or we need to call an ambulance, but something needs to be done here. But despite the pain she was in, Peggy was still a little bit reserved about it. She thought maybe she could just sleep it off. But as they're having this kind of back and forth about what to do, Pi would return from his hunting trip. He would come in the house, and right away Dwayne would run over to him. He would explain to Pi, hey, this is not normal. My mom never, ever acts this way. She never complains. This is really serious. You got to take her to the hospital. But Pi would actually say, she's fine. I'm sure she just has a fever or maybe the flu. She'll sleep it off. But when he walked into the bedroom and he saw his wife looking so horrible and literally squirming in pain, he relented and said, okay, I'll take her to the hospital. And so Pi would have to literally carry Peggy out of the house, put her in his truck. He drove her to the hospital and then had to carry her into the hospital. And by the time Peggy was under doctor's care at the hospital, she no longer could talk. She was just moaning in agony from this excruciating pain in her limbs, and her heart was still racing, and she was nauseous and she was vomiting. I mean, she was really spiraling quickly. And so after she's been admitted, the doctors turned to Pi and to Dwayne and to Sissy and to the other family members that had assembled, and they asked them, do you have any idea what could have caused this? And they all said, no, she just suddenly started feeling this way. And so the doctors, who were unable to ask Peggy, she was in such blinding pain she couldn't even talk, they just began running her through a wide-ranging series of tests to try to figure out what was going on. But when these results began coming in, either she was negative for the thing they were testing for, or it just came back that everything was normal. And so they're looking at Peggy, seeing her completely falling apart. None of their tests have revealed anything is wrong with her. And so they're at a loss. They don't know what's wrong with her. And so without a better option, they just put Peggy into a hospital room and begin monitoring her. And sure enough, after being in the hospital for 3 days, Peggy's symptoms would come down. While she wasn't back completely to strength, she was able to speak again. She was able to eat and drink water and move around. She was still very uncomfortable. Her heart would still race periodically, and she would get fits of pain in all of her extremities. But overall, she felt like she was really improving. And so after 3 days, she was discharged from the hospital. And so Peggy and her family, they drive back to their home, and initially, everything's okay. It seems like she's on the mend. But within 24 hours, Peggy's heart starts to race again, and before long, her arms and legs feel like they are on fire. Now, Peggy and her family, they know that the doctors don't know what this condition is. And so their immediate reaction was huge concern that Peggy, again, was suffering from this horrible thing. But going to the hospital didn't really feel like the obvious first choice. In fact, the obvious first choice, at least for Peggy, was just to sit at the house and wait it out, the same way she had waited it out at the hospital. But over the next several days, despite laying in bed and resting as much as she could, her symptoms did not get any better. They got worse and worse and worse, to the point where she literally was completely bedridden, and all she could do was just shake and periodically scream into her pillow from all the pain she was experiencing in her extremities. And so finally, on October 30th, which was 10 days from the first day that Peggy felt these strange symptoms when she was at the diner, her family decided, you know what, enough is enough. She obviously is not able to just sleep off whatever this is. And so they called an ambulance, which rushed her to the hospital. And when she got there, the doctors, they remembered her from the week before. So they understood this was a bit of a mystery. But just in case, they ran the exact same battery of tests on her to see if maybe now there was some other indication of what this was. But again, all of the tests came back, and they either came back negative or inconclusive, or just showed that, nothing was wrong with her. The doctors even ran her through some tests for poison, thinking, maybe she accidentally ingested something toxic, and that's what's causing all of this. But those tests as well came back negative. And so totally stumped, the doctors decided the only thing they could do was once again put her in a hospital room and just monitor her. And so that night, Peggy was wheeled into a room, and all night, up and down that hospital wing, people listened to the sound of Peggy screaming at the top of her lungs from the pain she was experiencing. And then the next morning, the whole situation got even worse. Not only for Peggy, who by now was dipping in and out of consciousness, but also for the rest of her family. Because that morning, Peggy's son, Dwayne, and Peggy's stepson, so Pi's son, Travis, they were both admitted to the same hospital for exhibiting the same symptoms as Peggy. Their heart was racing, they were nauseous, they were vomiting, and their arms and legs were starting to tingle. And so the doctors, with nothing else to do, just ran Dwayne and Travis through all the same tests they had put Peggy through, and they all came back negative, or they came back normal. However, shortly after Dwayne and Travis had been admitted to the hospital, a neurologist who was looking after Peggy, he noticed something about her condition, and suddenly it was like his medical training from back in college kicked in, and he remembered something very specific that lined up exactly with what he was seeing in Peggy. And he suddenly realized that he knew what was going on. And so he told his colleagues, they ran out and they got this very specialized testing kit that doctors very rarely use. It's only for this one really specific and very rare condition. And they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy, and sure enough, the next day the results came back, and all three tested positive for this condition that the neurologist had guessed. And even though there was a cure for this condition, for Peggy, it was too late. Her body had been so completely ravaged that even if they administered the cure, it would not work fast enough to save her life. And so that day, the doctors went to Peggy, who despite being on all these painkillers is still squirming and writhing in pain and screaming into her pillow. They would tell her, "You're gonna die. The only thing we can do is try to make you as comfortable as possible, and then try to save your boys." Not long after being told this terrible news, Peggy would slip into a coma, and then 4 months later, on March 3rd, 1989, Peggy's family had to make the heart-wrenching decision to pull her off life support. And then at that point, she passed away. As for her 2 boys, Dwayne would remain hospitalized for 2 months and would make a full recovery. As for Travis, he would remain hospitalized for 6 months, and while he would recover, he would never walk normally again. Even though the actual medical condition that killed Peggy and nearly killed Dwayne and Travis was completely known at this point. Everybody knew what it was. What nobody could figure out was why this happened. Why in the world did this happen to these people? It made no sense. However, shortly after Peggy's death, that mystery would actually begin to unravel in the most bizarre and totally roundabout way. We've all been there. You're the host for the big summer barbecue, the guests are on their way, and you realize right at that moment as you're pulling it out of the oven that you've overcooked your zebra cornea souffle. With only minutes to spare, you leap head first out of your kitchen window, shattering the glass, cutting your body badly, and then you run into the nearby jungle and you tackle a wallaby and you knock a few teeth loose, you grab those teeth, you run back to your house, you dive back into your house head first through a different window. You cut yourself up badly again. You get inside your kitchen and you whip together a wallaby teeth salad just in time as your guests are coming in the door and right before you pass out from blood loss. Crisis averted, right? Wrong. Zebra cornea souffle and wallaby teeth salad, they're not good. But what is good is HelloFresh. HelloFresh is a meal service that delivers actually good tasting food right to your doorstep. Between menu items like cheese stuffed burgers and grilled salmon with balsamic tomatoes, you are not only going to wow your barbecue guests, but also you're going to avoid jail time for poaching wallabies and zebras, and you're going to avoid expensive medical and repair bills from all the jumping out the windows you were doing. HelloFresh recipes include pre-portioned ingredients, which means less prep time and less wasted food. HelloFresh also offers a line of kid-friendly recipes that are perfect for families that are looking to try something new as the summer winds down and we get ready for school to start up again. So, if you're ready to stop choking down zebra corneas and wallaby teeth, then you need to sign up for HelloFresh today. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com and use code Mrballen16 for 16 free meals across 7 boxes and 3 free gifts. Again, go to HelloFresh.com and use code Mrballen16 for 16 free meals across 7 boxes and 3 free gifts. Okay, back to the story. There is an international organization called Mensa. That's not an acronym. It's a Latin word that roughly translates to table or mind. And this organization is a highly exclusive society for the ultra intelligent. You literally have to prove that your IQ, which is an intelligence test, ranks in the top 2% out of everybody in the entire world. And even then, you may not be smart enough to get in. And in the same town that Peggy and Pi had lived, in Alturas, Florida, there was a chapter of Mensa. And the way some of these chapters worked is they would just get together every month and do some sort of intellectually stimulating activity. And in Alturas, that Mensa chapter, what they would do is they would get together at some private location once a month, and they would put on what they called a murder mystery weekend. The members of this chapter would head off to some private location like an inn or a hotel or a cabin or something, and they would all role play a murder investigation. So one or two of the Mensa members would come up with a very elaborate murder and subsequent investigation, and they would assign different fake characters to each of the real Mensa members. And so once they got there, they'd all find out what character they were and what they were responsible for. And then once they got into character, which included dressing up in costumes, they would remain in character until the killer was revealed. And so this activity was meant to be extremely intellectually challenging, but also it was extremely fun. The group loved these murder mystery weekends. And so with that in mind, just a couple of weeks after Peggy had passed away. So this is sometime in April of 1989. A new genius was accepted into the ranks of the Alturas Mensa chapter. Her name was Sherry Gwynn, and she was a middle-aged woman who had recently fled from Texas to Central Florida to get away from her abusive husband, who still lived in Texas. After she was accepted into the Mensa chapter, it became abundantly clear to the members that Sherry was eager to make friends. But not just any friends. She wanted to make friends with two very specific members of the Alturas Mensa chapter, and they were Diana Carr, who had no relationship to Pi Carr or his family, and Diana's husband, whose name was George Trapal. Diana was a very successful orthopedic surgeon who had her own practice in Alturas, Florida, and George was this computer programmer who had more advanced degrees than you could count. And, critically, Diana and George just so happened to live right next door to Peggy and Pi's house. Even though Sherry came on really strong right away to try to become friends with Diana and George, neither of them were fazed. The couple just figured, here's a woman who's living by herself. She's moved to a brand new area. She's run away from an abusive husband. It's no wonder she wants friends, and so she probably just needs some support. And so Diana and George were happy to just become her friend. The same month that Sherry was accepted into the Alturas Mensa chapter, George and Diana happened to be chosen as the people responsible for coming up with the complicated scenario that the group would act out during their murder mystery weekend that month. So George and Diana very diligently sat down and went over how to make the case as complicated as they could, and George took on the responsibility of really focusing on exactly how the victim in their fake scenario would be killed, because he was really trying to make it as difficult as he possibly could, and he was trying to find the perfect murder that would be nearly impossible to solve. And so he came up with this very elaborate murder scene, and then between him and what his wife was creating, they put together this really intense and very complicated scenario that they were both very happy about. And so a couple of days later, it was time to head out for the murder mystery weekend that George and Diana had worked so hard on. And so they went and printed off a whole bunch of those cards that would have all the information about who each of the Mensa members were going to be in this role-playing game. And there was some initial information about the murder that was committed, the so-called perfect crime that George had come up with. And so they printed all those cards out, they grabbed their costumes, they packed their stuff up, they hopped in the car, and they drove to the nearby inn where they met up with the rest of the Mensa members, which included Sherry. And so they get to this inn, everybody checks in, and then afterwards, they all meet up in the lobby where George and Diana hand out their cards that have the information about the role-playing game. And so everybody's reading it and figuring out what they're going to do with their character, and everyone's also looking at this so-called perfect crime that George had come up with, that he was also very proud about, and he was kind of boasting to the audience about how difficult this weekend was going to be. He really came up with the perfect crime. And so as all the members are reading their cards, Sherry would see the murder weapon used in this game, and she would become fascinated with it. And she would make a point of going over to George and asking him lots and lots of questions about how he came up with this particular choice of a murder weapon, and what actually happens when this is used on a person, not just in the game, but in real life. It was like Sherry had become obsessed with this exact form of murder. She was so interested in it. And George, he was immediately aware that Sherry was kind of unnaturally interested in exactly how he had come up with the scheme, but in a way it was kind of flattering for George because he had spent a lot of time constructing it to make it as complicated as he could. And so he indulged Sherry, and he sat there and told her everything about this particular weapon and what it does to the human body, and how you can get it, and what the history of this weapon was. And the whole time Sherry is just totally locked in. I mean, she's really focused on this particular style of murder. And so that murder mystery weekend would eventually come to an end, and all the Mensa members would think it was great, and they would head home. And then over the course of nearly a year after that, Sherry would be a near constant in George and Diana's lives. I mean, she was always around them. She always wanted to meet up with them. She was always talking to them and asking them questions and calling. And anytime she was with them, she always wanted to be with George. And when she was with George, a lot of times she would bring up that very particular murder method that he had come up with for the murder mystery weekend. And George just continued to think this was just the greatest thing. It was so flattering that she thought he was so smart that he had come up with the perfect crime. And so anytime she wanted to talk about it, he would just indulge her because it made him feel really good. And if George and Diana had seen any red flags in Sherry with her behavior towards them, they certainly didn't show it. They basically were operating under the assumption that Sherry, no matter what, was just this helpless, harmless person who had come to Central Florida and she was trying to be their friend, and so they should try to be her friend back. But, as they would soon find out, they were very, very wrong about Sherry. In December of 1989, so roughly 8 months after George and Diana had first met Sherry, Diana decided she wanted to move her medical practice from Alturas to a neighboring town called Sebring. And the drive from where their house was in Alturas to where her new office was going to be was just far enough that it made sense for George and Diana to relocate to Sebring. And when Sherry discovered that the couple was moving, she immediately called George and said, "Please let me rent out your house. I don't have a place to stay. I've been staying with friends. I'll pay whatever rent you want." And as it happened, George and Diana had actually talked about keeping the house and renting it out. And so it was actually a pretty easy decision. They trusted Sherry, and so they said, "You know what? That's fine. You can rent out the house for a couple of months and then we'll decide if this is a long-term solution or not." And within just a couple of hours, Sherry was on Diana and George's doorstep with a sleeping bag and a small bag of toiletries ready to go inside. And so George and Diana, they grabbed the last couple of things they needed, and then as they walked out the front door, they gave their house key to Sherry and told her, hey, if you need anything, just give us a call. And then George and Diana, they climbed into their car, and as soon as they had drove off and were out of view, Sherry dropped her things and she kind of looked around, and then she ran inside of the house. And just minutes later, practically the entire Alturas Police Department came crashing through that front door after Sherry. And within an hour, the police department would find something that would not only reveal the true identity of Sherry and her true intentions, but it would also reveal the truth about what happened to Peggy and her family. A couple of days before Peggy first started feeling bad, when her heart started racing and her arms and legs began tingling at the diner, a couple of days before that, someone had placed 8 Coca-Cola bottles, so full sodas, glass bottles, inside of Peggy and Pi's kitchen. And they set these 8 drinks kind of tucked away inside of a storage nook. A couple of days later, the family discovered these sodas, but they didn't think anything of it. They figured somebody else in the family had bought them and left them in the kitchen, and so they were fair game. And so before long, Peggy and the rest of her family were drinking these Cokes. But Peggy, who was notorious for loving Coca-Cola, drank way more than anybody else. Well, it would turn out all 8 of those Coca-Colas had been tampered with. They all contained a significant dose of the heavy metal called thallium. Thallium is odorless, it's colorless, it's tasteless, and even though there are very small trace amounts that naturally occur inside of our bodies, if there's even a little bit more than that inside of our bloodstream, it becomes lethal. And so when Peggy was admitted to the hospital the second time, around the same time that Dwayne and Travis were also admitted, that neurologist who was looking at Peggy, what he noticed about her condition was that her hair was starting to fall out. And that's when it clicked for him. He had this flashback to his medical training where he was taught about thallium poisoning. And one of the symptoms was hair loss. The other symptom was extreme pain in the extremities. And so the neurologist and his colleagues went and got a thallium test kit, and they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy, and they all came back positive for thallium poisoning, but the level of thallium inside of them was astronomical. The boys are lucky to have survived. They had 20,000 times the amount that naturally occurs inside of the human body. As for Peggy, she had an astounding 50,000 times the amount that naturally occurs. way more than was lethal. And so that was why the doctors told her, there's nothing we can do. Your body is basically already dead. You're just technically still alive right now. And so the rest of the family, besides Dwayne and Travis, would also test for thallium, and they would all, with the exception of one child, have elevated levels of thallium. However, compared to Dwayne, Travis, and Peggy, of course, their conditions were negligible and they would all make full recoveries. And so the doctors realized fairly early on that this family has been poisoned, and so they contacted the police, who launched an investigation. And right away, their primary suspect was Pi. He and Peggy had been fighting extensively before she fell ill. He also had that kind of abrupt hunting trip that lined up with the day Peggy started feeling sick, and so they're thinking, okay, well, did that have something to do with how he planted the thallium? And then also there was the fact that Pi worked at the phosphate mining company, and so had access to fairly rare chemicals. However, upon closer inspection, Pi did not have access to thallium specifically. Thallium is incredibly rare and very expensive. And it just seemed odd that he would use thallium to poison and kill his wife, but he would also poison himself and his son, who he adored. It just didn't really add up. And so Pi would get ruled out as a suspect fairly quickly. But during one of his last interrogations, he would give the police something he didn't think was very valuable, but it wound up being very significant. He would say that 3 months before Peggy got sick, their family received a death threat. He opened the mail one day and there was this typed out note that said, your family needs to leave Florida in the next 2 weeks or you're all gonna die. But Pi thought it was some stupid teenage prank, and so he didn't think anything of it. And then when 2 weeks went by and they weren't dead, he just kind of forgot about it. And so after the police have ruled Pi out as a suspect, they didn't know where to turn. They had no other suspects. And so they just began focusing on who might have written this note. And that's where Sherry comes in. Sherry Gwynn was not a Texas transplant who had come to Central Florida to run away from her abusive husband. Sherry Gwynn wasn't even her real name. Her real name was Susan Galeck, and she had lived in Central Florida for most of her life. Susan was very smart, but she certainly was not Mensa-level genius smart. And so almost certainly her paperwork that got her in to the Alturas Mensa chapter was forged. Susan also had absolutely no interest in becoming real friends with Diana and George. The only reason she was pretending to be their friends and wanting to be around them all the time is because she was studying them. Because Susan was actually an undercover police officer. She had been sent undercover after the police discovered Diana and George were responsible for that death threat letter that was sent to Peggy and Pi. It would turn out Diana and George hated Peggy, Pi, and their kids. They hated them. They thought they were obnoxious. They were too noisy. They were annoying. And so Diana, who for context was the type of person who would stop people mid-sentence and correct them if they ever referred to her as anything other than Dr. Carr, she had gotten into at least 1 or 2 serious yelling fights with Peggy and with Pi and their kids when she had gone over to tell them to turn their music down and be quiet and do this and do that. And Peggy and Pi, they're not putting up with that. They just told her to get out of here. As for George, he didn't get into any public altercations with Peggy and Pi and their family. George was a very meek and submissive guy. He was very meager, and he was mostly a recluse. But he spent virtually all day peering out the window at Peggy and Pi and their family, studying what they were doing and obsessing over how noisy and obnoxious they were. And as he's seeing his wife getting more and more frustrated with their neighbors, George finally decides he's going to take drastic action. And so that's when George types out that death threat and he sends it across the way. But after Pi reads it, nothing happens. They don't leave Florida within 2 weeks. And so George went to phase 2 of his plan. George had actually spent time in a federal prison in the 1970s for cooking meth. And one of the byproducts of making meth is thallium. So George used his old meth cooking skills and he whipped up some thallium and he put lethal doses of thallium in 8 different Coca-Cola bottles. And then after mixing them all up so you couldn't tell there was any chemical inside of them, he used his bottle topping machine to put tops back on top of each of them. George made his own beer, and so that's why he had a topping machine at his house. And so with his 8 deadly drinks all prepared, looking like brand new Coca-Colas, George waited until Peggy and Pi and her family were out of their house, and then he snuck over and he walked into their kitchen and he placed these Coca-Colas right down on the kitchen counter and he slid them into a storage nook, and then he left the house, and that was it. And over the next several weeks, he watched with absolute pleasure as the family got sick and then Peggy died. While George never actually admitted that he had poisoned his neighbors, he did do some things that really tipped off Susan that he had to be the guy. Like, for example, that Mensa mystery murder weekend, the murder method that George had come up with was poisoning. And remember, at that point, Susan has been sent undercover to find out if George and Diana are responsible for poisoning their neighbors. And now George is sitting up there talking about the perfect crime he's come up with, and it's poisoning. And so that was why she had followed up with him really specifically on, wow, what else do you know about poisoning? And how'd you learn about poisoning? And what kind of poisons do you know about? And over the following months, even though Susan never got George to actually admit to her when she was undercover recording him that he was the poisoner, she did completely earn his trust. And she did this by always making sure she was very submissive around him and always made sure to stroke his ego and remind him how smart he was. I mean, George was used to being in a relationship with Diana, who was extremely overbearing and kind of kept him under her thumb. And so Susan kind of allowed George to feel like he was in control for once, and he loved it. And so he completely trusted Susan to the point where when he and Diana were going to move out of Alturas, they were willing to rent their house to Susan. And this is important because the house had not actually been emptied. A lot of their things were still in the house, including George's things. And so he just assumed Susan would never go through his things. But as soon as Susan was in that house and she watched George and Diana drive off, she immediately called in backup. The police swarmed the house, they searched it top to bottom, and in the garage they found George's chemistry equipment, and nestled underneath it was a bottle that contained thallium. George would be found guilty of first-degree murder as well as attempted murder on the rest of Peggy's family, and he would be sentenced to death. As of this episode, he is still alive and he is still on death row. As for his wife, Diana, who many people believe must have had something to do with the poisoning, or must have at least known it was happening, was never actually charged with anything. And so she would eventually divorce George and move on with her life and remarry. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to come ballroom dancing with you. But when you get out on the dance floor, just start stomping all over their feet and don't acknowledge it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. In 2017, 27-year-old Lydia Makarchuk left her home country of Ukraine and moved to Bracknell, which is a town just outside of London. Shortly after moving into her new apartment, Lydia went out and got a job as an accountant at a local hotel, and then after that, Lydia pretty much swore off her social life and instead just focused exclusively on working hard and saving money. The one reprieve she got from work was going to church on Sundays. 2 years later, Lydia was at her church enjoying the coffee hour that always followed the Sunday sermon when another member of her church, who she didn't really speak to, this 41-year-old man named Norbert Varga, approached her and kind of awkwardly complimented her shoes. And she was so flattered by this that it opened up a friendly conversation between the two of them. And during this conversation, Lydia was pleasantly surprised to find out that Norbert was an expat too. An expat is someone who lives outside of their native country. Norbert had moved to the UK in 2018, so that's 1 year after Lydia had moved to the UK, and he came from Hungary, which shares a border with Ukraine. And just like Lydia, when he got to the UK, he kind of put all his energy into his work and trying to save money. He was a radio technician and a photographer. And so the two spend the rest of this coffee hour chatting and enjoying each other's company. And then afterwards, when they left the church and they both got home, they both found themselves thinking about the other. There was clearly an attraction there. And so the following Sunday, they both very eagerly rushed back to church in order to spend more time together. And sure enough, during that coffee hour, they spent the the whole time together, just chatting it up. And then afterwards, they exchanged phone numbers and made plans to get together outside of church. They were going to go on a date. And so the rest, as they say, is history. 2 years after Norbert complimented Lydia's shoes, they got married in Bracknell. And while the wedding was great, unfortunately, none of Lydia's family members, who were all in Ukraine, none of them could attend the actual wedding. And so the newlywed couple decided the way they would handle that is their honeymoon would be spent in Ukraine. That way Lydia's family could celebrate their wedding as well. For a variety of reasons, this honeymoon trip to Ukraine kept getting pushed back, but finally in September of 2021, everything lined up, everyone was available, and so Norbert and Lydia rushed to the airport and they hopped on a flight. And during this flight to Ukraine, Lydia remembers being so excited specifically about her husband finally getting a chance to spend some time with her 29-year-old younger brother Miroslav. Lydia was very close with her brother, and so it mattered to her greatly that he and her husband had a good relationship. But to that point, because of the great physical distance between the UK and Ukraine, the two had really not had that much interaction, and so they really didn't know each other very well. And so this trip was really important to Lydia, and Miroslav, he really picked up on that because he put together this camping trip for the end of their stay in Ukraine, where he knew he'd be able to step aside with Norbert and chat with him and get to know him a little bit. And so that was kind of like the fail-safe, where if he and Norbert did not get a chance to speak all week because they were visiting with so many people, they would have a chance to at the end of the week on this camping trip. So after a few hours of flying, Lydia and Norbert touch down in Ukraine, and they make their way to Lydia's family's house where they're going to be staying for the week. And that night, and for the next several days, the couple was swamped with several family reunions and meetups with old friends that hadn't seen Lydia in years. And so Norbert and Miroslav were not getting any time to themselves, and Lydia really knew that. And so she and Norbert began looking forward to this camping trip because that not only represented a kind of peaceful break from the chaos of all these reunions, but it also did represent the one chance they knew Miroslav and Norbert would get to interact with each other. And so finally, September 15th, the end of the week, it came, and it was time to go on this camping trip. And so Lydia and Norbert and Miroslav and 9 other family members, they all packed up their tents and their camping belongings, and they loaded up a couple of cars, and they drove over to the base of the Carpathian mountain range. This mountain range, which stretches for nearly 1,000 miles across Eastern and Central Europe, are very popular amongst tourists because it's stunningly beautiful. Everything is green and lush, and there are these crystal clear lakes and breathtaking waterfalls and all these amazing animals running around, and there's no mosquitoes, and they have these really cool hikes that bring you up to these very impressive overlooks. And so that night, Miroslav had made reservations for this one campsite, this very popular campsite that was up in this clearing, not too far up the mountain, and it had this great view down to the forest below, and because it was in a clearing, it had this unobstructed view up to the sky, where in this area, you could look up and just see stars in every direction. And so when Lydia and the rest of this group arrived in the parking lot of this mountain range, they were all really excited to get up to this campsite and just enjoy being there. And so they park their cars, they get their gear out, they find the trailhead, and then they begin hiking up the mountain. And about 2 hours later, they arrive at this clearing. They find their campsite, which was marked by this small fire pit underneath a couple of trees. And so they go over and they set their tents up, and some people go out and get some firewood. And then before long, a fire was made, and this group of 12 people that had not seen each other in so long, they just sat down and began enjoying each other's company. They put tea on, they were swapping stories. It was really just this wonderful time. And then around 8 p.m., the sun started to set, at which point this huge group just stopped and enjoyed this beautiful sunset. And then once the sun had gone down, there were 2 kids that were there on this trip, and so they were put to bed in their tent. And then the remaining 10 adults just kind of hung out by the fire and enjoyed each other's company. And it was actually during this second half of the night that Norbert and Miroslav finally really got a chance to just chat with each other. So for about an hour, they were talking to each other, and Lydia is just watching this happen, and she couldn't be happier. This is like the perfect ending to this trip. And then around 9 p.m., Norbert stands up. Lydia sees him stand up, and he tells the group he's going to run back to his tent, which was a ways away from the campfire, and he was going to get his camera. And so Lydia said, okay, no problem. And she remembers watching him walk off into the distance, because when you're at the campfire, if you're looking away from the campfire, everything is pitch black in that direction. And so she watches him disappear into the darkness, and then she and her brother and everyone else just kind of turn back towards the campfire. And then all she remembers about what happens next is she heard a whistling sound. And at first it was very faint, But it started to get very, very loud, and when it got loud, she tried to kind of figure out where it was, but before she could, suddenly something hit her in the face, predominantly hit her in the nose. And as soon as it did, she went blind, she went deaf, and then she felt herself on the ground, and she has no idea what's going on, and all she can remember thinking is, oh my God, something horrible has happened to me. I might die. I don't know what's happening, but I might die. And so she started praying for herself to survive whatever was happening to her, and then her hearing started to come back just a little bit. Her vision was still totally blurred. She could only kind of tell where the fire was because it was bright, but her hearing, it started to come back, and that's when she heard moaning coming from somewhere near her. And so she's thinking, okay, whatever horrible thing has happened to me has happened to other people too. And so instead of just praying for herself, she began praying for everyone who was at this campsite. And so as her hearing is getting louder and louder, and she's hearing more and more moaning and crying happening all around her, she suddenly hears her husband screaming her name. Her vision is still gone, but she knows it's him, and he lands right behind her and he grabs her and he's just repeating her name over and over and over again. And then Lydia manages to kind of choke out to her husband, what happened? And there's a pause, and then Norbert says to her, it's bad. It's really bad. It would turn out their campsite was on a battlefield from World War I, and buried underneath the soil right under their fire pit was an unexploded bomb from World War I. Meaning, for over 100 years, countless campers have arrived at this campsite and lit fires on top of this bomb that they couldn't see. And each fire gradually eroded the outer metal casing of this explosive until finally that night in September, with Lydia and 11 of her loved ones nearby, their little fire finally was it. It pushed through that last little bit of the casing and it ignited the bomb and it detonated. That whistling that she heard was the sound of the fire finally cutting through that casing and being exposed to the fire. And then that thing that struck her in the face, that hit her right on the nose, that was almost certainly a piece of the bomb itself. So shrapnel that was cutting through her face. And then the moaning she heard was primarily her brother, who was right next to her. Lydia would be gravely wounded, but she would survive. As for her brother and another man who was not named, they would not survive. Here is a picture that was taken of the group literally minutes before this bomb detonated. At 11:40 a.m. on December 21st, 2003, three young men who were longtime childhood friends hopped in a truck and began traveling south. They were 22-year-old Brett Mann and 19-year-olds Sean Blowers and Ashley McGuff. They lived in a coastal city called Darwin, which is actually the capital of the Northern Territory in Australia. The Northern Territory, also known as the Top End, is located in the central north of the continent. It is 6 times larger than the UK, but has 280 times less people living in it. Specifically, the UK is home to roughly 70 million people, whereas the Top End is home to only 250,000 people, and half of them live in Darwin. There are many reasons why the Top End is so underpopulated, ranging from politics to poor infrastructure, but the most obvious reason that so few people choose to live in this part of Australia is because it is wildly rugged and dangerous. It is scorchingly hot year-round, and the weather in general is just unbelievably unpredictable and violent. And as the old saying goes, all the animals there are trying to kill you and each other. But Brett, Sean, and Ashley had grown up in Darwin, and so they were accustomed to the hazards of living in the Top End, and so they weren't really concerned about them. What they were concerned with was finding things to do and not getting bored in the city. That particular day, in order to ward off boredom, the trio had decided they would head out to a salt flat that was located about 50 miles to the southwest of Darwin. It was this wide open plain that they could just race around on their quad bikes on. And so they loaded these quad bikes into their trailer, attached it to their truck, they hopped in their truck, and at 11:40 a.m. they started heading south out of Darwin. The first road they were on was this fairly desolate dirt road that wound around through the wilderness, and it passed by the iconic eucalyptus trees that are very well known in Australia. It passed by palm trees and giant termite mounds. And after driving on this dirt road for about 30 minutes, the trio passed by the tumbling Waters Holiday Park, which is a vacation resort for adventurous families. And then beyond this park, there really was no more civilization. They were headed right into the outback of Australia. And so this was kind of like the last mark of civilization. And so the trio, they drive for another 30 minutes past the park. And at some point, all of the trees on either side of the road start getting more and more dense until they begin kind of encroaching over the road, as if it looks like you're driving directly through the heart of a jungle. And they would have recognized this change in scenery as meaning they were nearing the Finnis River, which was off to their right beyond all of the trees. So they couldn't see it, but they knew they were close. And the Finnis River was not a huge waterway. It was a 30-mile stretch that ran east to west through the top end. And what it was known for was being very brackish and dark. You could not see into this water more than maybe an inch or two. So it almost appeared black. And so the trio continued driving along through this kind of jungle atmosphere until the left side of the road began to thin out again. And then it eventually revealed the salt flats up to their left. And so at that point, the trio pulled off on the right side of the road where the vegetation was still very thick. And then the trio hopped out of the truck, they went around to their trailer, they dropped the gate, and one by one they pulled their quad bikes off, and then each of them hopped on and drove out onto the flats. That day, the flats were actually very muddy because it had recently rained really heavy in that area. And so the trio spent just as much time racing each other on the flats as they did trying to drive close to each other and spray mud on each other. And so for hours they were out there having a great time, and then at 4:30 p.m. they decided it was time to call it a day. And so they drove back over to the truck, they drove their quad bikes up onto the trailer, they locked it, and then they were about to get into the truck to head back home when one of them suggested, hey, let's head down to the water and rinse our clothes off and get all this mud off of us. Now, you need to understand, in the top end, the place you want to spend the least amount of time in is the water. People in the top end assume that in any natural water body that is not clearly designated as a swimming area has at least one animal lurking in it that will kill you. This is a literal precaution people in the top end take. And so this section of the Finnis River that these three friends were thinking about going and jumping into and washing off inside of, this was not a clearly designated swimming area, and so it should be avoided. But you need to remember, these three guys, they grew up in the top end. They were used to living in this kind of wild area, and they'd also come to the salt flats so many times over the years, and they had jumped into the Finnis River before to wash off and go swimming, and nothing had ever happened. And so really, the idea that the Finnis River could be dangerous to them, it didn't really cross their mind. They felt like, you know what, we've been there, done that, nothing's gonna happen to us. And so they left the truck and walked away from the salt flats into this mangrove forest that's only a couple of feet off the road and began walking towards this river. Normally, the trip from the road through the forest to the river bank, basically where the forest ended and you reach the river, it would take about 10 minutes. But after walking in this mangrove for maybe a minute, they were already standing in river water. It was only a couple of inches of this water, but it signaled to the guys that clearly the river is very swollen from all of the recent rains, enough so that it overflowed beyond its natural boundaries and it's flooded the mangrove forest. But the three guys, they look at each other and think, meh, what's the big deal? I'm sure we'll be fine. And so the guys continued moving on, but as the mangroves began to thin out, they began to slow down dramatically because the riverbanks on the edges of the Finnis River were very steep. If you were standing on dry land, if there was no flooding, and you were right on the edge of the Finnis River, if you took even 1 or 2 steps into the river, you would slip down under the water and the water would be over your head. Now, as these guys are walking, because the ground is flooded with this black, brackish water, they couldn't see the ground, and so they couldn't tell where the drop-off into the river was. And so they began to slow down, and then when all the trees were practically gone, they knew they were close, and then one of them actually slipped and kind of tumbled down the edge for a second, but he turned and he grabbed one of the roots of the mangrove tree and pulled himself back up. And then the other two, after seeing this, they walked over and stood next to him, and the trio just stood there looking out at this pitch black looking river that was very clearly moving faster than normal because of all this excess rain. But they kind of looked at each other and thought, you know what, it's not that big of a deal. You know, we'll hold on to the roots of these mangroves and lower ourselves over the embankment. We'll wash ourselves off, pull ourselves back up. no big deal. And so they each turned around and grabbed a root of one of the many mangrove trees that marked the edge of this forest, and while holding on, they would lower their lower half down past the embankment until they were submerged. They rubbed all the mud off of themselves, being very careful not to let go of the mangrove at any point. And then as they were about to finish up and pull themselves back up and get back to their truck, Brett loses his balance and somehow lets go of the mangrove root and slips down the steep embankment, and suddenly the current takes him away from his friends and out to the middle of this river, and before long he's getting pulled downstream. And so he yells out to Ashley and Sean, who had their backs turned to him. They turn around, they see their friend, and they instinctively leap into the river to try to go get him and help swim him back to the side. Now all three of them were very competent swimmers, and so this was not a high panic situation. This was more like a inconvenience and maybe a little bit funny, and so that's why they leapt in no problem. They figured, worst case scenario is we'll drift somewhere down there and we'll get out and we'll walk our way back to our car. But as soon as Sean and Ashley were free floating in this river, they felt how strong this current was, and it was way stronger than they were anticipating. And so they actually started to get a little bit worried, and they looked up ahead of them, and Brett, who had been in the water for 10 or 15 seconds before they leapt in, he had already moved way farther downstream than them. And so they decided, you know what, we have to get out, but we need to get to Brett first. We all need to get out at the same place. And so they decide they're going to swim downstream, meet up with Brett, and then get the heck out of that river as fast as they possibly can. And so they yell out to Brett hey, we're coming to get you. And they start swimming as fast as they possibly can. And with the help of the current, they manage to get all the way up to Brett relatively quickly, maybe a couple of minutes. And when they reach him, Sean and Ashley go in front of Brett. And then the three of them, they stop actively swimming and they allow the current to just kind of carry them downstream. And as they're drifting, they begin scouting the left side of the river for a solid clump of mangrove trees they can swim into. Because unless there's something to grab onto on the edge of this river, they can't pull themselves out. And so at this point, the trio is definitely uncomfortable being in the water because of how strong that current is, but they're confident they're going to find a viable landing spot and they're going to get out of here and it will be a great story. And so Sean is in the front, Ashley is right behind him, and then Brett is behind Ashley. And they're all about an arm's length away from each other. And they're drifting down this river for a couple of minutes. They're looking on the left side for a viable landing spot. And then all of a sudden, Ashley just yells out, "Hey, I see something in the water. We need to get out. Find the nearest tree. Get out, get out, get out." And so Sean, he starts panicking. He doesn't even turn around to see what's going on behind him. Adrenaline kicks in and he swims as fast as he possibly can to a tree that's popped out of the river. It's literally growing in the middle of the river. And so he swims up to this tree. He manages to climb up to the first fork of the tree, which is maybe 6 or 8 feet above the water. And as soon as he's up there, he turns around and looks down and he sees Ashley. He reaches down and he hoists Ashley up to the first fork with him. And then the pair turn around again to grab Brett, but Brett's not there. And so they look around, they're thinking, okay, did Brett not make it to the tree? Did the current pull him around? Is he at some other tree? They're yelling out for him, they're looking for him, but there's no Brett. And so they're talking to each other, Ashley and Sean. They're saying, hey, did he call out? Did you hear something? Did he give some indication about where he was going? And they're saying, no, I don't know where he is. And so they start climbing up the tree a little bit and trying to look down and up the river to see if maybe they can see him. And then all of a sudden, Sean notices something yellow flash beneath them in the water. And so he looks straight down and he sees this yellow thing down there. And so he nudges Ashley and he says, look. And so Ashley looks down, and as they're looking, they're about 10 feet off the water at this point. They see this yellow thing start rising up to the surface. Now the water is so dark, they really can't tell what anything is unless it is at the surface. And so they're watching this yellow thing, and suddenly it comes out of the water and they see it's Brett. He's got his yellow jacket on. That's what they saw. And Brett is in the mouth of a 13-foot long saltwater crocodile. He is face down and his left side is being held in this animal's mouth, and he's not moving. And so Sean and Ashley are so scared, they're just frozen. They're just staring at this monster that's in the water, that's holding their friend underwater, and they can't do anything about it. And for 2 minutes, they just stand there looking at this animal, wondering what's going to happen. And for those entire 2 minutes, the crocodile stared right back up at Ashley and Sean, as if it was showing them what it was going to do to them once they got in the water. That I've done this to your friend, I'm getting you to as well. And so they're staring at this animal when suddenly it just kind of goes underneath the water back down into the black abyss, and it, along with Brett, just disappear. Ashley and Sean are so terrified that
that they can't even grieve for their friend. They can't feel sad for him. It's like they just go into survival mode. And without saying anything to each other, they just start climbing up this tree as fast and as far as they possibly can. And they only manage to get up maybe a couple more feet to 2 more branches. One's at about 10 or 12 feet off the water, and the other is at about 15 feet off the water. And so Sean makes it onto the lower branch, and then Ashley makes it onto the slightly higher branch. And then once they're situated on their branch and one arm is firmly wrapped around the trunk of the tree, they're able to kind of breathe for a second and take stock of their situation. And even though, of course, the elephant in the room here is that their friend was just eaten by a crocodile, but it's like they can't process that yet. Instead, they start talking about, okay, well, our families, they're going to recognize our absence and they're going to tell the police, and the police are going to launch a search and they're going to come find us. Both of them were confident, or they acted confident, that that was going to happen, but they also knew that there was no timeline for this. It could be hours or days until this actually happened. And so as these two teens are sitting on their branches, the reality of their situation really started to come crashing down on them. Because yeah, they're safe in this tree, but how long can they possibly stay in this tree for? I mean, eventually they're going to need to fall asleep. And if they fall asleep, are they going to fall out of the tree and land in the water with this crocodile? I mean, they just didn't know how this was going to turn out. And so as the two began comforting each other, reassuring each other that, oh no, it's going to be just fine. Someone's going to find us tonight or tomorrow. We'll be just fine. As they're doing that, Ashley suddenly stops talking to Sean and just looks straight down. And so Sean realizes what Ashley's doing, and he matches his gaze. And he looks straight down, and at the base of their tree, in that black water, is the 13-foot-long saltwater crocodile. It's back, and it no longer has Brett in its mouth. They have no idea where Brett is. He's just gone. Saltwater crocodiles are considered the most aggressive and dangerous crocodiles in the world. And they are one of only 2 crocodile species that will actively hunt humans when given a chance. And so these two teens are helpless in this tree. All they have is some separation from the black water and this animal down below. And so they just find themselves staring straight down at this crocodile. And in turn, this crocodile just stares right back up at them. It's very clearly waiting for them. It wants them to come out of the tree so it can eat them. And so the crocodile just continuously repositions itself all around the tree. It's just keeping the top of its head out of the water so its eyes can look up at them. And so the teens are just praying that at some point it will grow tired of them and will leave. And after several hours, right as the sun is about to set, this crocodile does seem to give up on them, and it drifts under the water and disappears. After a couple of minutes, Sean, who was on the slightly lower branch, decides he doesn't want to be any closer to the water than he needs to be, and he's going to climb up to Ashley's branch. And so he very carefully stands up on his branch. He makes sure he's got solid footing, and then he reaches up and he grabs a branch with his right hand, and he kind of tests it, and he feels like it's pretty sturdy, and then he puts all his weight on it and tries to reach for another branch when this one breaks. And as soon as that branch broke, Sean tumbled 10 feet into the water. And so he hits the water, he goes all the way under, he sinks a few feet under, and immediately he's turned around and he's trying to swim as fast as he can to the surface, and he's just expecting at any moment this crocodile is going to bite him. He gets to the surface and he looks around. It's a little bit dark, but he can immediately see his tree, and he realizes the current has pulled him away from his tree. And so in a panic, he starts swimming and kicking his legs as hard as he possibly can to get back to this tree. And he knows the whole time he's kicking his legs, he's just attracting the attention of this crocodile, but he's got nothing else he can do. He's got no other tree he can reasonably get to that will provide safety from this animal. And so with every ounce of energy he's got, he kicks and swims, and finally he manages to grab a root of this tree that his friend is still inside of, and he begins pulling himself with his lower half still submerged in the water. And so as he's dragging himself towards the trunk of this tree, he's just waiting for this crocodile to bite down on his legs, and finally he gets to the trunk of the tree and he's able to pull his body out of the water, and he clambers up to that original branch he was on, and then he and Ashley work to get him up to Ashley's branch. And as soon as he sits down next to Ashley and he's secure, they both look down, and just a little ways away from the tree, basically in the area where Sean had just landed in the water, they see with the little light that is left, this crocodile swimming right back over to the tree, and it camps out right underneath. Sean had gotten out just in time. When the sun finally did set about 10 or 15 minutes later, it became pitch black. There's no ambient light in this part of the world. There aren't any buildings or cities close enough to this area, and so it is truly pitch black. And so they could no longer see the crocodile down below. But they knew it was there because periodically they would hear it repositioning itself right underneath them. Also, because it was so dark, the two teens could not actually see each other. And so they began holding on to each other, and then anytime either of them moved, they would announce their movement to the other, just so they knew they had not fallen asleep and were not falling out of the tree to a horrible death. And so a few hours went by like this, where it was silence with the exception of the sounds of this crocodile repositioning itself periodically. A little after midnight, a huge storm rolled into this area, and it began absolutely downpouring, and the raindrops that were hitting the river were so loud that the teens could no longer hear the sound of this crocodile, and so they had no idea if it was still down below them or not. But every time lightning would strike, it would illuminate the sky for that flash of a second, and in that flash they would look down, and there would be the crocodile. After several hours of this super intense downpour, the two teens also started to become concerned that all this additional rain could raise the water level of the river all the way up high enough that this crocodile might be able to jump out and reach their legs. But because it was so dark, they couldn't actually see the top of the water, and so they had no way of knowing if the water levels were actually rising or not. And so they both kind of sucked their legs up onto this branch and tried to make themselves as small as they could while still remaining anchored to each other and also to the branch, and that's how they sat for the next several hours, just hoping they would survive the night. Finally, when the sun came up that following morning, the teens immediately noticed that the crocodile was still right below them, just lurking at the base of the tree waiting for them, and they also noticed the water level of the river had clearly come up quite a bit. And so if they weren't rescued soon, there was a good chance that another heavy rainstorm, that crocodile would be in range of them, and there was nowhere they could go. They were as high up as they could get. Not to mention the fact they were hypothermic, they were weak, they were tired, and if you fall asleep, you're gonna fall in the water. And so the two teens, they knew they did not have much time left. Luckily, at 10 a.m. that morning, they heard the sound of a police officer who was out in the mangrove forest. It turned out their families had recognized their absence. They had called the police, and that morning a search had been launched. They had found their truck and then had been walking down the river yelling out to them, and then they finally did find them. Initially, when they located these two teens stuck in the tree, they called in a helicopter to hover over them and lower down a ladder that could climb back up. But when the helicopter got close to this tree, the rotor wash from the spinning blades, it practically blew the boys out of the tree, and this crocodile was still in the water. The rescuers could see it, the boys could still see it, and so there was this fear that the helicopter would literally send them into the water to their death. And so they had to abandon the helicopter approach. However, the blades of that helicopter did ultimately scare this crocodile, and the crocodile swam away. And so as soon as the helicopter was off station, they had a boat come in, and the boat got right underneath the two boys. They jumped down into it, and they were brought to safety. The two boys were brought to a hospital where doctors determined they were physically okay, but both of them were severely traumatized from what they had just been through. As for Brett, despite an exhaustive search of that river, they never found his body or any of his clothing or any belongings he had on him, and they never found the crocodile that killed him. In 2019, a 32-year-old United States Army soldier was stationed in Hawaii for training. This was his first time ever being in Hawaii, and so on his first day off, he planned to do some sightseeing. After doing some research, he settled on the Hawaii Volcano National Park as the first place he would go check out. This is one of the top tourist attractions in Hawaii that sees over 2 million yearly visitors. One of the main draws of this particular park is that it's home to one of the world's most active volcanoes, the Kilauea, that has been erupting consistently almost every year since 1983. On the evening of Wednesday, May 1st, John finally was given some time off, and so he hopped in his rental car and he made his way out to the park. When he got there, he was pleasantly surprised to see that it was not crowded in the least, most likely because he was there midweek. And so he paid his entrance fee, and then he started walking up a trail that would bring him up to this overlook that overlooked the caldera. The caldera of a volcano is the actual crater, the inside of the volcano where the actual lava comes out of. At the time John was at the park, the volcano was not actively erupting, and so there was no pool of lava inside of the caldera. However, the surface of the caldera, which was 300 feet below this overlook where John is, the surface was still 2100 degrees Fahrenheit, causing these massive steam clouds to billow up from it pretty much constantly. And so when John actually reached this overlook point and was looking out into the caldera, he was immediately disappointed because he couldn't see anything. And so as much as John craned his neck to try to get a better look down into the caldera, he was just totally obscured by the steam. Now, he was up against a safety railing that prevented people from getting closer, but he figured if he could just get right to the edge of this crater and he could actually look down inside, he might be able to see all the way to the base of the caldera. And so he looked around and noticed there were no other tourists up there with him. So he thought about it for a second and then decided, yep, I'm gonna do this. And he stepped over the safety railing and walked right to the edge of this crater overlooking this caldera. And as soon as he got there, he suddenly had this unencumbered view of the space directly at the bottom of the edge of the cliff. He could actually see down into the caldera now. And so he got his phone out and he started taking some pictures, and then all of a sudden the ground underneath him began to shift, and it shifted so quickly and so suddenly that threw him onto his back. And as he's laying on his back scrambling to get back up again, the ground underneath him just completely collapses, sending him careening down 300 feet into the scalding hot caldera. When John fell, another tourist did happen to walk up another nearby trail, and they actually saw him as he fell. And so they called 911, and immediately first responders were on scene, but they were facing the same issue that John was, which is the steam was so intense inside of this volcano that you can't really see down into it. And so they had rescuers walking along the rim of the volcano, and they had helicopters in the air, but it really wasn't doing any good. And in the back of all rescuers' minds, they knew that realistically, there's just no way John could have survived this. I mean, you can't survive a 300-foot fall, but even if you did, you couldn't survive being at the surface of the caldera that's over 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. You'd die within a couple of minutes. But the rescuers pushed that thought out of their mind, and they focused on being positive and just continuing to look for John. And 2 hours into their search, when it was totally dark outside and hope was just about gone at this point, somebody spotted John on a little ledge jutting out 70 feet down from that cliff he was standing on. When he fell, when the ground dissolved underneath him, he managed to land on this tiny little ledge. Had he fallen an inch left, an inch right, an inch forward, he would have tumbled to his death. There's no two ways about it. But he landed perfectly on the one ledge that could have saved his life. But he was so badly injured, he couldn't climb back up again. However, rescuers were able to rappel down to him, put him in a harness, get him back up, and he was able to make a full recovery. In December of 1961, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together as they were both avid outdoorsmen, and so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold. There might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods.
And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful and our stuff's getting wet and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard and it was starting to get dark outside. And so the pair decided, you know what? We got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree, because at least that way they're off the ground, they'd protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they are just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. And at some point they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are. And now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second, and James Sr. pulls out his map and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around, he's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going. When his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything, he said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight. And it's hard for me to stand even. I'm going to sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this, because it was a pretty miserable night the night before. And so it makes sense he might be tired. But they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on. They do have food. They do have water. And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before when they were up in the tree, even then it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up and it was still snowing and they're still lost, he had that optimism, and so did his son. But now thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here and we're going to eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of this situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, he said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders. And for 3 hours, James Sr. just continues to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with his son and he puts his son down by a tree and he sits down next to him and he's totally defeated. And he's like, we got to get ready for another night. We got to get back up in a tree and we got to do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're going to get James Jr. up into a tree for the night because, he's too weak to climb up himself, they both notice these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that look like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm gonna go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here, I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights because these lights are their lifeline, and he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him to the point where James Sr. stops. And he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point, the lights just kind of disappear into the forest and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around and he realizes, there's no road over here. I am in the middle of the woods. Like, what were those lights? And so he stands there for a minute thinking to himself, am I losing my grip on reality? Like, what's going on here? And he turns around and he starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is now gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is, how? Because he couldn't walk until now, and my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground. And so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree, he picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by presumably his son. And so he's walking along these footprints and he's yelling out for his son, he's not hearing anything, and this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? We're obviously in this together. Like, what's going on with my son? And so he's walking, and after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in with snow. And finally, it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. This is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's gonna be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction, and holding onto his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they had parked their car over at Larch Mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigged and zagged all over the mountain and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found a road, and he traced it up to this lodge, and he told the staff inside, my son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there. And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon that, the fire inspector's son is missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain as well to assist in this search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize as, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks, but no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially the thought was, well, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? And why did he take his shoes and socks off to do that as well? And what were those lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? Because they weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that suddenly James Jr. up and walks away. When most people picture Russia in their minds, they picture European Russia, which is literally the part of Russia on the western side that sits in Europe and is by far the most populated part of the country.
But European Russia only accounts for 23% of the total territory that is Russia. The other 77% is to the east of European Russia. It starts at the Ural mountain range and it extends all the way over 5 million square miles to the Pacific Ocean. And this vast, mostly forested expanse, which is 50 times bigger than the entire United Kingdom, is called Siberia. And Siberia is absolutely brutal. In Siberia, it is almost always freezing cold. Literally, the average annual temperature across all of Siberia is 32.9 degrees Fahrenheit, so it is 0.9 degrees above freezing on average every single day. In addition to the extremely deadly weather that exists basically year-round in Siberia, Siberia is also home to a bunch of huge deadly animals, such as the brown bear, which is the same as the infamous grizzly bear in North America, the gray wolf, which by size alone makes virtually all other wolves look like little puppies. Gray wolves can grow to be nearly 200 pounds. And of course, there is the highly intelligent Siberian tiger, who is perhaps one of the only predators on Earth that is known to seek out and kill people for revenge. For example, in 1997, a hunter named Vladimir Markov was walking through a Siberian forest when he came face to face with one of these Siberian tigers, and he ended up shooting the tiger before fleeing, except the tiger didn't die. Instead, it got up and secretly followed Vladimir all the way back to his cabin, and then this tiger camped out outside of the cabin until Vladimir came out again, and the tiger pounced, killed him, and ate him. And so, unsurprisingly, Siberia has an absolutely minuscule population relative to its massive size. However, there are some adventurous people out there who are drawn to Siberia for the same reasons that most other people avoid it. These adventurous people see Siberia as one of the last truly wild places on our planet, and they want to experience it for themselves. And one of these highly adventurous people was a young man named Colin Madson. Colin, who came from a very successful American family, was a big outdoors enthusiast who at some point in his youth began researching Siberia because he fell in love with its rugged natural beauty. He quickly began researching not only Siberia, but Siberian culture and Russian culture, and also at some point he became fluent in the Russian language. Then, in 2013, when Colin was 22 years old, he left his home in Missouri and moved to Siberia. He settled in one of Siberia's few population centers, a city called Irkutsk, which is located in the southeast of Siberia and right along the edge of Lake Baikal, which is the world's deepest freshwater lake. Colin's Siberia plan was twofold. He would go to school while he was there, and he would go out and explore. And at first, his plan went perfectly. He was accepted into Moscow State Linguistic University in Irkutsk, and very quickly he made friends who were eager to accompany him on his adventures out into the Siberian wilderness. From his arrival in Siberia in 2013 to 2016, Colin did well in his studies, and he spent countless hours exploring the forests and mountainous areas all around Lake Baikal and right outside of Irkutsk. In fact, Colin became so familiar with this region that he began volunteering with a nonprofit in the area that went around marking new trails, which meant Colin was literally venturing into the wilds of Siberia and just marking the trail as he went. So when Colin's family heard about what happened to him in 2016, they could not believe it. In March of 2016, Colin and 3 of his good hiking friends, one was American and 2 were Russian, decided they wanted to go on a hike together. They settled on hiking to the summit of Love Peak, which was a mountain located a few hours away from Irkutsk in a small village called Arshan. This hike was nothing compared to the gnarly Siberian wilderness hikes all 4 of these guys had been on before. The trail that led up to Love Peak, it was fairly steep, but it was incredibly well marked, and all 4 of these guys had hiked it several times before. However, because Colin and his friends were so experienced at hiking in Siberia, they knew that even the easiest hikes needed to be respected because Siberia was still Siberia. There were dangers that lurked everywhere. And so the men called ahead to the village of Arshan, and they rented one of these small rustic cabins that's in the village that sits right at the base of Love Peak, and it's kind of tucked away in this forest. And so this cabin would serve as their sort of base camp and would allow them to arrive in Arshan, get their gear together, and then when they were ready, they could begin this hike to the summit. And so a few days later, on March 27th, Colin and his 3 friends loaded up their car and they drove west to Arshan. And when they got there, they stopped at a local store and got some supplies and then made their way to their cabin. Their cabin was just a single room with a few beds inside of it. It was enough to protect them from the elements, but really nothing more. As for a toilet, the cabin didn't have one, but there was an outhouse outside that they could use. So after the friends moved into the cabin and claimed their beds and put their things down, they all sat down and began prepping their gear and eating some food and chatting. And then finally, at 2 a.m., they decided they needed to go to sleep because their plan was to get on the path up to Love Peak by 7 a.m., which meant they needed to get up at 5 a.m. to make their final preparations. So at 2 a.m., the lights in the cabin turned off and the friends all fell asleep. And then 3 hours later, at 5 a.m., when the lights came back on again, it was immediately clear something was wrong. Colin was not in his bed. His friends assumed, when they looked over at his bed and saw his personal belongings were all still there, that Colin must have gotten up and headed outside, maybe to use the outhouse or go for a quick walk, and they just hadn't heard him leaving. And so the 3 friends initially just kind of shrugged off Colin's absence and said, he'll be back any minute, most likely, and if for some reason he's not back soon, he'll certainly be back by 7 a.m., because that was the agreed upon time they would leave for this hike. But as the minutes ticked closer and closer to 7 a.m., and Colin still had not shown up or tried to call them or do anything, the friends started to worry. It just didn't make any sense that Colin would just get up and leave without telling them where he was going. Finally, at 7 a.m., when Colin still had not shown up, and the friends' cursory search of the outside area near the cabin had yielded no results, they decided they had to tell someone. And so they wrote a note addressed to Colin, and they put it on the front of their cabin door. And this note basically just told Colin, if you come back here and you see this note, know that we're looking for you. So stay put or tell someone you're here. And so after putting up this note, the friends left the cabin and they headed to the nearest police station where they reported Colin missing. The police would eventually launch this huge search in and around Arshan, both in the forested area right around the village and then also up into the mountains near Love Peak. But despite this huge effort, no one could find Colin, at least not at first. On Monday, April 4th, so 8 days into Colin's disappearance, a group of searchers were looking in the forest about 1 mile away from the cabin where Colin and his friends had been staying. And they look up ahead and they see there is this clearing and there's something in the middle of it. And so the searchers begin moving their way towards this clearing, ducking under branches and stepping over brush. And when they get close enough, they can see Colin is in the clearing, and Colin is deceased. He was laying flat on his back with his left arm extended out to the side and his right arm extended but closer to his body, and both of his hands were clenched in tight fists. And on his hands and his wrists were visible abrasions and cuts, which later would be determined to have most likely been caused from someone or something holding on to him, trying to restrain Colin. Colin also had visible abrasions and cuts on the front of his neck. Colin's clothing, which consisted of a long-sleeve thermal shirt, heavy pants, and hiking boots, were ripped and torn in several places. And interestingly, Colin was not wearing socks under his boots. Now that seems inconsequential, but Colin had had surgery on both of his ankles and had scar tissue on his ankles that if he didn't have socks on, those scars would rub against the inside of his boot, and he said it was very painful. So he always wore socks. Also, Colin's body showed virtually no signs of decomposition, and all of his wounds and abrasions looked, quote, fresh, according to medical personnel. In short, Colin looked like he had recently been in some sort of physical altercation, and whoever or whatever he was grappling with had eventually overpowered him and killed him, although it was not clear how he actually died. Russian authorities were very quick to suspect Colin's 3 friends who had been with him, but they were brought into the station and they denied having anything to do with Colin's death, and they all passed their lie detector tests. After that, Russian authorities quickly closed this case by concluding that, well, if his friends didn't do it, then that means Colin must have been high on drugs or drinking alcohol or both, and he just wandered out of his cabin and he got lost in the woods and he died of hypothermia. He froze to death. The end. However, Colin's parents just could not accept that as being what happened to their son. There were a lot of reasons for skepticism, but the main one was that Colin was an absolute expert at navigating this particular region of Siberia. And so the idea that he would leave his cabin for a quick walk or something and get so completely lost that he would die 8 days later seemed way too far-fetched. And so Colin's parents hired a US-based private lab to do a review of Russia's autopsy of Colin to give their opinion if the autopsy was accurate or not. And this US-based lab pretty much immediately found that the Russian autopsy was not remotely accurate. Number 1, Colin was not under the influence of alcohol or drugs. He was sober. Although technically he did have very small amounts of THC in his urine. THC is the chemical that is found in marijuana, but the amount was so little, it basically meant he had consumed the THC days before he went missing. And so he would not have been remotely affected by that small amount of THC in his system. Number 2, the lab determined that Colin almost certainly did not die from hypothermia. Instead, all signs pointed to Colin dying from being suffocated, meaning he was murdered. Someone crushed his airway or in some way restricted him from breathing, and that's what killed him. And 3, based on the lack of decomposition, the freshness of the injuries on Colin's body, and the lack of animal predation on his body when they found him, indicated that Colin did not just wander out of his cabin and immediately die somewhere in the forest. Instead, he was alive for most of the time people were looking for him, meaning when they found him, he likely had died within hours of being found. And so these findings by this US-based lab kind of create a general theory about what must have happened to Colin. After Colin left the cabin in the early morning hours of March 28th, maybe to go to the outhouse or to go for a quick walk, when he went outside, someone or something was nearby, and they either lured Colin to them or they straight up ambushed Colin and took him away. Now, we have no idea what happened to Colin after he was abducted, but we can safely assume that after being abducted and taken somewhere, he was alive, and he stayed alive for several days until on the 8th day of his disappearance, Colin was killed, likely by his captor, either at the spot where he was found, or he was killed somewhere else, maybe in the forest, and then moved to the spot where he was found. Many people believe it was the Russian government who targeted Colin, they kidnapped him, and they killed him. And their botched investigation into his death was actually a calculated cover-up. Colin had participated in at least one peaceful environmentalist-led protest in Siberia, and after the protest, Colin apparently got a written warning by the Russian police not to attend another protest. But why would Colin, who was just one of many people involved in these protests, be singled out by the Russian government and killed for his participation? And why would the government elect to kill Colin when he was with 3 of his closest friends who would immediately notice his absence? It just doesn't add up. Today, Colin's parents are still trying to figure out what happened to their son, but unfortunately, their son's case is closed in Russia, and so no one on the Russian side is talking to the parents or giving them any new information. And so as a result, they and the rest of us are left to wonder who or what was lurking in the shadows when Colin stepped out of the cabin that morning. And then where did they take him? And what did they do to him for nearly a week before they killed him deep inside of that Siberian forest?